It's time for my virtual Jericho with John Mair.
Hello and welcome to a brand new innovation. It's my Jericho Virtual Book Club. Once a month we'll examine books. We're not going to examine them line by line as book clubs do. We're just going to inform you about them and try and persuade you to buy them. Most to be available in good bookshops. Today we've got four authors talking to us, and they're talking about two books. One is a personal autobiography, and one is about Bob Dylan at 80. There we are. There's the two books: Secrets Never to Be Told by Fiona Chesterton, and Bob Dylan at 80, which is edited by Gary Browning, who's the Jericho resident. Now let's move to the first one if we can. Secrets Never to Be Told. Fiona Chesterton and I go back far too long, probably 40 years to working on Nationwide together in the late 70s, and we've known each other ever since then. She is a former Channel 4 commission editor, former commission editor for Daytime, former head of BBC Education. She's been around the block in television, but now she's written this book, which is all about her life history. Fiona, what's it all about?
Well, it's not a life history, really. It started with a letter from Canada 10 years ago, informing me that I had inherited some money from a Canadian man I'd never heard of. It sounded a bit like a scam, but it wasn't. And I made a sort of journalistic investigation of it to try and find out about the people in Canada from whom I'd received this mystery sum of money. And the more I went into it, the more and more interesting things I found. And I started to think, you know what, I'm going to have to write this up. I'm going to have to make maybe a long essay of it. And then, as I found out more and more, it became the germ of a book. And indeed, that is what I've written. And why the story was of particular interest to me was the person at the heart of it is a young woman who was illegitimate, and she was farmed out to a housekeeper many years ago. We're talking about Victorian times, and she grew up for a life of domestic service in England, but actually she emigrated at the age of 35 on her own, and I realised that was very courageous or desperate. And so I wanted to learn more about her. And the reason why I had a particular personal interest in it, and this is where the other family secret comes in, is that when I was in my 40s, I discovered that there was a big family secret around me as well, which is that I too was born outside wedlock. And a whole sort of web was built round me to make sure I never knew. And I grew up in a working class part of Leicester. I don't have a Leicester accent, you can probably hear. And I had elocution lessons when I was young. And my mum and dad were determined I should leave my destiny, as it were, in Leicester to work in a factory or whatever. And I went to grammar school, and eventually I got a scholarship to Oxford. And that is my link to Oxford. I was at LMH for 3 years, and also I have visited Oxford ever since, very frequently. So if not my second home exactly, Oxford has a very warm place in my heart.
You're going to read an extract from the book, aren't you?
I hope I'll have time to read two. What I'm going to read is a very short extract, which comes reasonably early in the story when I take my first of 2 trips to Canada. In the first one, I go to Halifax in Nova Scotia, which is where many, many immigrants from all over the world arrived in Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I found myself one day in what's called the Pier 21 Immigration Museum with my daughter, who was who accompanied me on that trip. So here goes. We decide to take the tour. Our guide asked the members of the tour party, who has family who emigrated here? Perhaps after the Second World War, she suggests. Several people put their hands up. Do I put mine up too? Cousin Jessie is family now to me, isn't she? I decide not to, but just on a technicality, because it wasn't here that Jessie landed. As we walk round the spacious floors, an uplifting ambience seems to wrap itself around us. Perhaps inevitably, Pier 21's portraiture of the immigration experience in the 19th and early 20th centuries is on the rosy side. For one thing, as it's focused on those arriving by sea, there's little reference to the many arrivals who I've learnt came over the land border from the States. Among them were many enslaved people of colour and other fugitives from the American lawman who were not so well received. The fact was that some immigrants were deemed more desirable than others. Fortunately for Jessie, white working class English women were on the desirable side of the tally. Since the 1870s, domestic servants, overwhelmingly female, were deemed preferred occupations along with farming families. Jessie's timing was also fortunate. The early 20th century was a period of huge expansion in Canada, especially in the West. Jessie was one of 1 million or so British immigrants who arrived in the decade before the First World War. One of the exhibits catches my attention. It's an advertising poster published around 1910 by a Canadian government agent based in the City of London, and which proclaimed its offer of assisted passages to farm labourers and female domestic servants by the magnificent steamships of the Allan Royal Mail Line. Highlighted in red is its offer of free grants of land, good wages, cheap provisions, light taxes, free schools. How alluring a prospect that would have sounded for someone like Cousin Jessie. We arrive now at the mock-up of the Canadian Pacific Railway's so-called colonist trains and accept the tour guide's invitation to sit in a carriage and view the projected image of mountain scenery from the window. How marvellous that first sight of the Rockies would have been to Jessie, used as she was to the flatlands of East Anglia. How daunting too those towering snowy peaks might have been. It would not have taken her much time on this journey to confirm that she really was in a foreign country, as her train wended its slow way through thousands of miles of vast, still only partly tamed wilderness. That cross-continental journey by the steam trains of the Canadian Pacific Railway took immigrants like Jessie a full week more after their long sea journey. This was not a picture postcard tourist ride. It was surely a journey into the unknown.
How was she related to you, or your mother rather?
Mother's side, very, very remote, really. But in a way, the family tree and the remoteness or otherwise of our connection was not the point. I became very close to her emotionally because of what I felt was the fellow feeling I had for her. And I can't tell you all that I find because it would be too much of a spoiler, but she has quite a tough time. And you see the picture on the cover. That was where she and the little boy, also born out of wedlock in Canada, that's where she lived for many years. It is not a comfortable cabin. It is a pretty primitive shack, such as many Canadians living in the countryside, or in the prairie, as they would call it there, endured. But she was a woman on her own, so it was particularly tough for her.
Now, on to your own family. Your parents had great ambitions for you, didn't they? I mean, they
Well,
sent you to grammar school.
well, they never started out wanting me to go to Oxford, or particularly. They just wanted me to have a good life, you know, such as many parents have. But I know now, I didn't realise then, I just thought they were parents for whom I was the centre of their world. They did sort of live their life, particularly my mother, vicariously through me. And my mother too had a very tough time, it turns out, because of the shame of illegitimacy that hung over many, many women. Any of you who watch that television programme called Long Lost Family will realise by now just how many women like this there are with stories like this, but also the really visceral shame there was, and the hardship and the prejudice there was until really relatively recently, until probably the 1970s or 80s. I mean, we think of the 1960s when I was a child as a liberating period. We're about to have the Bob Dylan's put centre stage. But in fact, if you were living in a Midland city, as I was, a long way from swinging London, the attitudes were still really 50s attitudes, and 1950s attitudes weren't that far distant from Victorian attitudes. So from the attitudes there were when Jessie was born. She was actually born in Cambridge, the other place. I'm trying not to mention Cambridge in this session, because it might upset one or two people, you know, because I know Oxford and Cambridge, as we know, are big rivals even now. But honestly, the life she started on was really governed by the fact that her mother gave her away as a baby, and she was thought therefore to have no prospects in life, barely any education, you know, just the sort of life that many, many thousands of women had. And I do think this actually as quite a feminist book. The lead characters are cousin Jessie, my mother, and me, and so I hope it is one that a story that people will relate to and understand a bit more, not just about conditions in Britain, but also I learned through my journey an awful lot about Canada. We have perhaps a sort of rosy glow about Canada, a bit like Australia, you know, places where people go to, you know, to make $1 million or to transform their life. Yes, sort of, yes, many people did. But as you might be reading now a little bit more about what I would call the underside of the British Empire, and the Dominion of Canada had its dark secrets too. You know, there have been stories very recently of how really appallingly First Nations people were treated, particularly the children, who could be, you know, sort of just put away in institutions as if they were of dubious intellect, you know, and many of whom died. So I'm hoping this book, even though it is a very personal story and it's a family story, has much bigger themes as well. And therefore, I hope it will be of some interest to social historians and of interest to anybody who wants to learn more about life in the last century and the experience of women in particular.
Now, back to you. When did you discover that you were born out of wedlock, and what effect did that have on you?
I was in my 40s. My mother had virtually a breakdown. She was in her 70s by then. She has another breakdown much earlier on, which is described in the book. But she had a breakdown, had to go into care at short notice, and I had to clear her flat very quickly. And I just took armfuls of stuff, put them in plastic bags, took them to my house and didn't look at them for a while. And then one day I looked at the papers and I came across a load of papers I'd never seen before in my life. And I realised they explained at last what was the real story around me. I'd had an intimation as a child that something wasn't right. I think children do have real instincts and understanding of their situation we don't quite understand. But I was in my mid-40s, and you say, how did it affect me? In some ways, I had a very delayed response to it, because I suppose it was only after my mother died, and my mother died only 2 years before I got the windfall inheritance. It was only then I began to reassess my relationship with my mother and my childhood and everything else. So, you know what life is like. Normally, you just get on with the day to day, and you don't have time for introspection or thinking about stuff. You just get on with the business of living and working and bringing up your family and all that. It did take me a while to realise that my dad was my father, and my parents lived together all my life, but they weren't in a position to marry until I was 24 years old and already at the BBC, and they didn't tell me a thing even then. And I'm not going to tell you all the big reveals, because you're going to have to buy the book to find out all the big reveals.
Available on Amazon. Or did you ever talk to your mother about it once you discovered?
No, it was her lifetime secret. I mean, the other point I really try and make in the book is we find this hard to understand now, because we're so used to just sharing everything, all our emotions, all our experiences. But my mother's generation, the generations before that, you shut up, you got on with things, you didn't tell secrets. And so I thought if she chose to tell me, I would certainly listen, but I thought it would be too upsetting for her if I told her that I knew everything. And so, no, she never talked to me at all.
No.
So I don't know, have you got time for the second excerpt? Because
you have, certainly, because you escaped from working class Leicester and came to Oxford, of course, to Lady Margaret Hall.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a very different extract. It's much later in the book than the other one. And what I would like to point out is, if you're a working class girl in Leicester or Leeds or Bradford or anywhere else back in the late 1960s, Oxford was a pretty alien environment. And so I found it. So this is an edited extract from the book of my application for Oxford and my interview. After my long summer of rigorous preparation and equally rigorous diet and exercise regime, then a final period of intensive study at school, I'm about to be tested. One other girl and I have just sat the series of special papers set by Oxford and Cambridge universities for entry next year. I had to choose 2 colleges to put down as my first choices, one at Oxford and one at Cambridge. There are only 5 colleges, all women's, of course, to select from in Oxford, and a mere 3 in Cambridge. For all I know about them, I might as well write the names on a strip of paper, put them in a tub, and take pot luck. In the end, I do find a couple of reasons to choose Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford. One, it has a river running through the garden, which I like the sound of. And 2, more importantly, there was another girl at my school 2 years above me who teachers tell me won a place there. I really can't remember why I chose Girton at Cambridge and why I opted for Cambridge above Oxford as my top choice. There have been no open days, and I'd never visited either city, so I had no idea what to expect. Could it have been because Joan Bakewell, who I liked from the telly, went there? When I'm offered interviews at both places, I'm shocked, and it causes quite a flurry, not just of excitement in mum and dad. They think I need to buy a suit for the interview. We're not expected to go in school uniform, and I have a very limited wardrobe given my few social outings. The interviews are in just a few days, so there's no time to lose. Mum and I go shopping in the sort of shops we never usually visit. Fenwick's and Marshall and Snellgrove's ladies' departments are not really the sort of places a teenager would want to go. Mum thinks I will need a new coat too, as it's December. Rather than a suit, we end up buying a matching dress and coat in a boucle wool, black with green piping, the dress a safe 1 inch above knee length. Very smart, and it fits my now petite frame well. But in truth, it's the sort of outfit a 40-year-old might wear to a job interview or a winter wedding. Well, what did I know? What pleases me most is that I'm now a size 10. We're expected to stay overnight at the colleges, but there's no money for a second outfit. So this will have to do for the 4 days in all that I will be away attending the interviews in the coming week. Now I left out the bit about Cambridge. The next morning, I'm off again, this time to Oxford and by the train. Summer holiday steam trains aside, this is the first time I've travelled this way. And at the age of 17 and a half, the first time I've gone anywhere on my own. So the trip to Oxford takes on a rather more exciting dimension long before I get to my destination. After changing trains at Birmingham, I get into conversation with a young woman called Mary, who's also on her way to Oxford and to the same college as me. She goes to boarding school somewhere in the home counties, and she wants to study English. She speaks impeccably, and I realise my elocuted vowels don't quite match her genuine accent. She's also effortlessly well dressed. I feel for the first time that my coat and dress ensemble isn't quite right. She's wearing a neat little jumper with a scarf tied just so around her neck, along with a kilt type of scarf, which is about 2 inches shorter than mine. How I think those 2 inches improve the look. We arrive at the college together and wish each other good luck. I can't remember for the life of me anything I'm asked at the interview. What impressed me was seeing women with more bookshelves in their rooms than I have ever seen before. Books to the ceiling, indeed. Whether they inquired about my newspaper reading habits or what my father did for a living escapes my memory. All I recall was the final meeting I had with an elderly woman with a twinkle in her eye, who was called Dame Lucy Sutherland. I have never met a dame before, but the college principal seemed friendly enough and her questions weren't too taxing. Oh, and I remember walking through the garden to see the River Cherwell with flat-bottomed boats I'd never seen before, moored by the river's edge. Afterwards, I have time to walk through the parks from the college into the centre of the city. The streets are lined with old stone buildings, quirky-looking shops, pubs and cafes. Although this city is very different from Leicester, I feel I can get used to living in a place like this. A few days later, and just a week before Christmas, I get a telegram. That's a first too. It's not like a letter. There's no space for detail, so its message is brief, to the point, and thrilling. LMH is offering me a scholarship named after someone called Alice.
Fiona, that's very, very good. Did Oxford make you? Did you make Oxford? Which way round was it?
Oh, Oxford had helped make me. You know, I think by the time you get to university, you're made by your parents, by your environment, by all sorts of things. And so I don't think it's all down to university, but obviously I met a lot of people who have become lifelong friends. And there is no doubt that in those days, and probably still, once you were a woman who'd been to Oxford, it was much easier to get a job, and a good job at that. So I got into the BBC training scheme, for example, which I honestly think now, with relatively limited experience I had of journalism or TV or radio or anything else, I think it would have been a lot tougher. But the fact is, once again, even then, there were 8 people selected for my training course, and I was the only woman. So the experience of Oxford, where there were way more men than women, stood me in good stead. And I think it stood me in good stead throughout my life, not least because it's still quite tough to being a woman. I don't care what anybody says. You know, there's lots of things where you're in the minority. And I wish all the very best now to all those people with different challenges trying to get into Oxford or any other good university, with the handicap of a disadvantaged background, a disability, from an ethnic minority, now, from a refugee background. I applaud them and wish them all the very best. But it wasn't easy for me, even though people now think she is an Oxford graduate, she's had life easy, she must have been from a very rich background. Well, I wasn't.
Very last question, Fiona. Now, do you keep in touch with LMH? What did you think of the recent?
Yes, I'm going there on Saturday. On Saturday. Because there was a reunion lunch that was supposed to take place in 2020 in June, and for reasons we know, it never happened. So it's happening at last on Saturday, and I feel I have to go as well because I did become president of the Junior Common Room when I was at Oxford as well. So I feel I should go sometimes to these sort of do's as well.
Okay, let's have a look at the book cover for last time and tell people how they might be able to get hold of it. The book is called Secrets Never to Be Told. Release date 21st of October. Available by the Conrad Press or Amazon and good bookshops. And Fiona, you're hoping to do a couple of terms at Blackwell's and Waterstones, aren't you?
Well, I've already succeeded in interesting Heifer's Bookshop, which is in the same book group as Blackwell's, and obviously Heifer is in Cambridge. So I really, really want to work hard to encourage bookshops to stock the book, because I'm a great believer in supporting local bookshops. So I would say to anybody watching this, go into Blackwell's, go into your local bookshop, wherever you are, and say, this sounds like an interesting book. Can you order it for me? And they will be able to.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on, if we can, to the second book, which is about Bob Dylan at 80. He was 80 in May this year. Not amidst a bit of controversy. This is a collection of essays edited by Professor Gary Browning, who lives right here in Jericho. It's 12 or so essays about Dylan at 80. You will have heard Gary Browning talking about it, but let's today talk to some of the authors in there. First of all, Professor Katharine Craik from Oxford Brookes. Katharine Craik, what's your take on Dylan?
Hi, John. Thanks so much for asking me to be a part of this conversation today. So my chapter in the book is on Shakespeare and Bob Dylan, which might be a slightly unexpected comparison, but if so, I think that's a marker of how far Shakespeare has travelled and how much we've forgotten about these works. Maybe you had to read Hamlet or Macbeth in school, and if you did, probably you were told it was good for you, almost like a form of medicine. But in their time, these plays were unbelievably popular, very, very accessible, a bit like Dylan's popular music today. People could afford to go and see the plays if they couldn't afford to buy the books, and they did, and that's because the plays are about everyone and for everyone, incredibly broad and capacious in terms of whose lives they attend to. And I think that's one of the things that Shakespeare shares in common with Dylan's art. It's very much alive today. The comparison isn't new. The New York Times in the 1960s called Dylan the Shakespeare of his generation. And more recently, The Guardian had a headline comparing Dylan to Shakespeare. And interestingly, Leonard Cohen to John Donne, who's perhaps a more introspective, lyrical, confessional writer. And all the way through his career, Dylan has pushed this comparison. In 2015, he wrote that he'd been trying for years to come up with songs that have the feel of a Shakespearean drama. And perhaps he succeeded last year in 2020 in his album Rough and Rowdy Ways with the song Murder Most Foul, which, as you probably know, is a very sort of long, epic song, which is about the assassination of President Kennedy. But the title of that song comes from Shakespeare's Hamlet, Murder Most Foul. when the ghost of old Hamlet tells his son about his death and calls it a murder most foul. And Dylan also released an album called Tempest in 2012, which of course shares a title with Shakespeare's play The Tempest. But when Dylan was pressed on that title, he said, "Oh no, it's not The Tempest, it's just Tempest." But that album contains several direct quotations from Shakespeare's plays, including a direct quotation from Julius Caesar. "I came to bury, not to praise," he says in the song Pay in Blood, which is a direct quotation from a line from Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. So all the way through his career, I think Dylan has been sort of pushing this comparison through direct quotation. But also, I think there are other much more sort of general ways that we can think about these two artists side by side. They're similar, I think, in terms of just the sheer volume of their output and their longevity as creative artists, the range and the depth of their creativity, their ability to ventriloquize a wide variety of voices from a wide diversity of perspectives. They've both had success in many different genres. Of course, Shakespeare wrote comedies, tragedies, histories, romances, lyric poems. And Dylan has similarly had success in so many different genres: folk, pop, rock, country, gospel, and has indeed experimented with drama at various different points in his career through his films Ronaldo and Clara, Masked and Anonymous. And he's even written a prose poem called Tarantula. So there's this incredible sort of wide variety of genres, which I think both artists have always practiced in.
Dylan is very good at hyping his own image. I mean, comparing himself to Shakespeare, it's a bit of a stretch, isn't it?
Well, you might say so. It's a bit of a stretch, but equally, I think there are ways to compare these artists that doesn't involve their biographies. Dylan has also said, "I am not the songs." It would be a bit like asking Shakespeare if he were Hamlet. So I think there are ways to compare their work that doesn't rely on mapping their biographies onto one another, or indeed mapping their aspirations onto one another. So my essay for the volume just takes one small comparison, really. I'm interested in a Dylan song, which you will know, I'm sure, and many people listening will know, called "A Hard Rain's a Gonna Fall" from 1962. And I've just compared that song with Shakespeare's Sonnet 66. And they have lots and lots of things in common, I think. Both are pieces about catastrophe and about our response to catastrophe. One is by a young man, so Dylan was only 21 when he wrote that song, and Shakespeare was, well, nobody's quite sure when the sonnets were written, but he was probably in his mid-30s, so they're quite sort of different, I think, in the way that they're thinking about catastrophe and responding to catastrophe, but they have lots of things in common. And one of the things they have in common, I think, is the formal shape of these pieces. So Dylan's song uses anaphora, as we call it. It just means that the same word repeats at the start of each line. "I saw a newborn baby with wild wolves all around it. I saw a highway of diamonds with nobody on it. I saw a black branch with blood that kept dripping." That phrase, "I saw, I saw, I saw." And Shakespeare does the same thing in his sonnet. He uses the word "and" at the start of each line. So there's this effect of sort of accumulation and repetition and increasing of intensity. And I think they both knew what worked lyrically and what works poetically to increase tension and to keep a reader or a listener involved. And both of these works also are very direct. I think they both involve spoken conversation. They're constructed like dialogues, as it were, and they both address a young man as well. So there's all these sort of thematic and structural and formal things that the pieces have in common. They're working in similar ways with sources as well. Both Shakespeare and Dylan were really interested in ballads, for example, in popular song, and how you can work with that material and reshape it. So there's lots of ways, I think, to think about Dylan and Shakespeare side by side without resorting to questions about biography or or necessarily comparing their work in terms of which is better. I think the thing is to focus on the texts really and on the work itself.
Do you think Dylan has read Shakespeare?
I think he's certainly seen Shakespeare. He's talked about productions of Hamlet and Macbeth that he's enjoyed. He certainly read the sonnets, and he said when he did, he could hear the guitar in them, which is fascinating. I mean, I guess if you have a musical ear, you hear music whenever you read lyric. And, you know, traditionally, historically, lyric poetry was to be sung to the lyre. So it is intrinsically musical. There's also these black and white pictures, I don't know if you've seen them, of Dylan posing in Elsinore in Denmark, which is the setting, of course, of Hamlet. So I think he's fascinated by Shakespeare. I think he, in many ways, his sort of slightly mysterious gnomic personality has a lot in common with Hamlet, actually, the way that Hamlet reveals himself really capaciously, really fully in these incredible monologues, but also you can never quite get a handle on him. So in that respect, I think there's some interesting comparisons too.
A last question from me, because I know you've got to go off. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he didn't turn up to receive it, of course. Did he deserve it? Was he a rightful winner?
Well, the prize was given to him, interestingly, for new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. And I would certainly agree that these are new poetic expressions within a song tradition. I mean, Dylan responded on this occasion that, as he put it, he had never once had the time to ask, are my songs literature? So he himself, I think, resisted this idea that his songs are literature, and it has an idea of sort of elitism, I think, of something exclusive. And I think Dylan's songs, a bit like Shakespeare's plays, are not fixed in that way, right? They're not fixed in the way that we might think literature is fixed. They're occasions, they're events, they're performances. They rely on a sense of liveness, I think, and of interaction with audience. And I guess the word literature doesn't quite fit Shakespeare either. That word was only just starting to emerge as a category at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, and it didn't have the same sort of meanings and associations as it does now. So I think it does. I think he did deserve it in the sense that these are works of incredible ambition and lyric complexity. But I guess I would share Dylan's own sense that perhaps his works are not simply classifiable as literature.
A one-word answer: would Shakespeare won the Nobel Prize?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that, John.
Would Shakespeare have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, do you think?
In his time?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very, very much indeed. And moving on, in the same book, which has got many interesting essays, one by Ray Foulk, who unlike everybody else here, is that he's actually met Dylan. He put Dylan on at the first Isle of Wight festival. He stole Dylan from Woodstock to put him on the Isle of Wight when you were 17 or how old were you, Ray? 17 or 18 or 19 when you did that?
I was actually 23.
23, right. There's the book, Stealing Dylan from Woodstock. What was Dylan like, Ray?
He was very quiet. He was with his wife, and he was going to bring his family with him, but there was a bit of a hiccup, and that didn't happen. But he was with his wife and just keeping himself to himself, rather. Then the band arrived, and he did some rehearsal with them. Personally, I kept my distance. I had to go there every day to look after the accommodation and deal with various details for the festival that was happening. And I didn't sort of try and engage him in conversation. He was there with George Harrison, who was sort of fawning over him. And I did witness a very wonderful duet that they both did of the Everly Brothers' Dream. All I want to do is dream. All I have to do is dream. But yeah, he was quiet. There was one point where he was certainly on a short fuse when he kind of lost his rag a bit with somebody, but not in a big way. But it kind of revealed that underneath there was a bubbling along a certain amount of anxiety.
If I remember from your very well-written book, which I recommend to anybody, by the way, you contracted him to do an hour, and he did an hour. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. Yes, but there's a lot of hype in advance suggesting that he was going to do a jam session with the Beatles and the Stones and everybody, and that would just hype. And I think his manager, Al Grossman, said, Dylan would like to go on there with the Beatles, but then, I'd like to go to the moon.
But at the end of an hour, he just stopped. The last song, and he didn't do encores, anything else.
No, he just stopped. And he did 17 songs, and they've been since released. It is exactly an hour in duration.
Now, how do you rate Dylan as an artist? I mean, apart from your coup of getting him to the Isle of Wight.
Well, I mean, obviously, I've become a great Dylan fan during the course of my life. I mean, at first, I didn't even know who he was. But, he's one of the great artists in all arts in the 20th century by a long chalk. And he's just phenomenal. I can come to the reason why just going through my chapter in the new book, which will help explain it, perhaps.
Okay, just a précis, please, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, I can't sort of tell you the whole chapter. I mean, well, first of all, as a historian myself, my interest is in people who are change makers, people that change things. That's what really matters. It's not a matter of just how good they are and how much you like them. Like's got nothing to do with it. It's how much they changed everything. And I would say that my comparison, if you think it's a bit odd comparing him with Shakespeare, I'm comparing him with Pablo Picasso. Obviously, totally, utterly different genre, but a different art form. But the similarities are quite uncanny. So that's really the thrust of my essay. And I could run through some of the bullet points. They've both got this incredible longevity and huge body of work, quite beyond what almost all other artists produce. They both of them draw from the world around them in a particular way, with Picasso drawing from Baudelaire's painting and modern life idea, and Dylan, of course, with folk and blues from the American songbook. I think an interesting thing about them both that kind of helped make them great and break out of the normal routine of being a rock star or a painter was that they didn't focus entirely on what, in Picasso's case, what it looked like, and in Dylan's case, what it sounded like. It was more to do with content. And they're both rebels, and they're both pretty radical about the way they went about it. And in that way, they're able to be these change makers and break the mold. I think Katharine referred to the periods of Dylan of folk and protests and folk rock and country and gospel and Christian and so on. Of course, Picasso was exactly the same in that he had his blue period, his rose period, African Cubism, neoclassicism and surrealism. So they seem to be following a similar sort of routine in going through different periods and not being predictable in what we're going to do next. Also, both of them very bursting with creativity to the point where they had to go and start venturing into other art forms. So, of course, we got Dylan, who himself is a painter and quite an accomplished painter too, with paintings commanding sort of six figures in galleries in Bond Street. And of course, he's been welding iron gates from farm equipment. Beautiful, beautiful work, which again commands huge acclaim and price tags. Films have been mentioned, but in the case of Picasso, he was going into filmmaking, photography, ceramics, and writing a play at one point. They both of them have to go beyond their main art form because they're just such creative forces, and they just have to keep going with new things.
If I can interrupt you, sorry to interrupt you, Ray, because we've got limited time. Do you have to be an outsider to be a great artist, do you think?
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily. But I think there's something here which it's the change-making aspect of it that matters. To be a great artist, what is greatness? I mean, greatness isn't about how much you like something. greatness is about how much you influence others or change things. And so whatever way you do it, it doesn't really matter, I suppose, for history's sake. You just, as a historian, you want to know who made the changes that mattered. There's one thing I left out, kind of just to deal with one item I didn't get into my essay, which is a shame, which occurred to me later, is that both artists made huge contributions in their work through being anti-war. And if we think of Picasso's Guernica, and we think of Dylan's protest songs or anti-war songs in the 60s, these were, of course, they're not unique. I mean, they're not the first artists who've done that by any means, but the fact that they became so famous and, major things in the public consciousness like no other, they both had these anti-war elements. And incidentally, Katharine, I think that I would say that Hard Rain's Gonna Fall is like Dylan's Guernica. Is a comparison there. So that's really
that's his masterwork. Now, will you be remembered for stealing Dylan from Woodstock? Will that be on your gravestone?
I think no. I haven't dined out on this all my life. I think it's a very minor footnote in one sense. I think that it's underrated in another, in that it was his only concert in 7.5 years. Now that's quite big in his career. For somebody that's done 3,000 concerts in the last 20 years, just did one in 7.5 years, and that was the Isle of Wight Festival. So the festival is sort of important. I'm not sure about me. The book, I hope, is a good analysis of what happened in his concert and how it all came about. And of course, it was followed up by the following year. It enabled the following year to happen, which was the greatest festival of the era, the 1970 Isle of Wight Festival with Jimi Hendrix and everyone. And it was only by virtue of Dylan the previous year that was going to happen.
Let's move on in music if we can. Thank you very much indeed, Ray. I said this book has got some 15 or so authors in it. One of them
it's actually 35.
35. Roger Dalrymple, who is a dean at Oxford Brookes. Roger, you actually maybe going to sing a bit of Dylan, aren't you, for us? Tell us what your interest in Dylan is.
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you for having me along this afternoon. So my contribution in the book is, as much as I appreciate the literary angle of Dylan, I'm also interested in the musical side of things, and particularly the fact that Dylan songs, it's so renowned that his live arrangements tend to deviate from any kind of template. And indeed, the more we learn about his career with the bootleg series and these alternate versions of recordings being released, the more we learn that actually for Dylan, there seems to be no template version, no kind of signature arrangement, and certainly not a scored arrangement. And yet there are, when you go to a Dylan concert and when you follow him through the years, as I have, there are sometimes these kind of musical compass points that certainly the musicians around him, some of whom I've met and discussed this with, they seem to be honouring and kind of working with. An example here would be from Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, so his early acoustic style. There he's doing a Travis picking pattern that's really quite distinctive, and when that lead-in is introduced to a Dylan song, you get quite immediate recognition of it. So it's kind of musical quote rather than a lyric-based quote. Similarly, when he started playing with other musicians, like in the 60s, Mike Bloomfield, the lead guitarist, there are a number of famous musical echoes that those kind of musicians stamped onto his arrangements. So on Like a Rolling Stone, you have that famous double stop phrase. On the song I Want You, you have this figure. But it's actually quite unusual for Dylan to have a fixed arrangement. If you went to a Rolling Stones concert, you'd hear a riff and you'd know the song immediately. With Dylan, these musical compass points or quotes are few and far between. And so I was really interested in my chapter to explore, well, what are the ones that have endured and that he's kind of let through and allows his musicians to play? Because there's some evidence that he encourages the musicians not to play any kind of template. And where those do still exist, why is he letting them stay? In the chapter, I'm exploring the idea that he likes to have some of these kind of set arrangements here and there as a kind of push-pull dynamic. It actually gives him something to bounce off, to be wayward with, and to take it somewhere different, which is very much the experience of a live Dylan concert.
Carry on. How do you rate Dylan as a musician, by the way?
I think he's very interesting player, very unique in his style. I mean, actually, if you were to hear those acoustic albums he did in the 1990s, it's very clearly him playing. He has all sorts of very unusual inversions and approaches to the guitar that are very distinctive. So in terms of playing in a very unique way and making the instrument speak for him, I think he's very accomplished. I think the last 20, 25 years, his musical vocabulary and the palette seems to be very much broadened by bringing in musicians who are very steeped in the jazz tradition and so on. And I think he's developed new styles in the light of that. So I often see him as a musicologist as much as a musician, and almost sometimes more the musicologist, kind of inviting the musicians around him to create a particular mood or style that he's orchestrating, rather than increasingly playing that himself. Because these days he largely sings, play a little bit of piano, but he's largely fronting the songs and doing vocals only rather than playing. In the book, I talk about a particular set of performances in the mid-1990s with Patti Smith, which I think are remarkable. These can be viewed online. You can track them down. And this is a song called Dark Eyes that he's playing with Patti Smith at her request. And what's very interesting about it is this idea of, with Dylan, there's never that sense of a musical template, as I was saying, but actually with the Patti Smith duets, she does seem to be encouraging him to work to the template of the recorded version. The song as recorded is very much a scored kind of song. It has a guitar part that's very distinctive. And that guitar part is the melody. The gentlemen are talking, the midnight moon is on the riverside. And notoriously, when Dylan sings live, he won't follow a set melody. He'll innovate and he'll riff on that melody. He'll do something different. What's amazing with the Patti Smith duets is she comes on and sings that template version, and you can see Dylan accompanying her, looking a little unconvinced at first, but gradually being won over, as if her performance is this kind of lodestone, drawing him back into offering the kind of template version. And that's a very unusual thing to see. There's been a couple of other examples. He played with an orchestra in Japan in the mid-90s, and there the orchestration obviously was scored and set. And you can see something similar happen, that his vocal style starts erring much more towards the template version, the recorded album version that people remember. But I'm particularly in the book interested in these Patti Smith performances, the idea that a strong duettist, a strong collaborator, has actually encouraged out of Dylan this quite rare approach of sticking to the template, offering a rendition of a song as the audience already knows it, but maybe slightly amplified, which is very different to the usually very dynamic and very different approach that he takes.
Now I'm springing this on you. Perhaps you'd play us out with a Dylan song. Which is your favourite Dylan song?
Gosh, well, my favourite is very long. It's Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again.
Try a shorter version.
I won't do all of that one. But why did I give us a verse of Tangled Up in Blue? Early one morning the sun was shining. He was laying in bed, wondering if she'd changed at all, if her hair was still red. The folks that set our lives together sure was gonna be rough.
They never did like Mama's home address. Papa's bank book wasn't big enough. He was standing by the side of the road, rain falling on his shoes. Heading out for the old East Coast, radio blasting the news, straight on through. Tangled up in blue.
I suspect we only have time for one verse of the 7.
Thank you very much. I think you're wasted as academic as a charge as a student wants it at Brooks. Right. Thank all 4 of you for a very entertaining hour. Every month we're going to have a book club. The next 2 have some serious stars taking part in them. I can't tell you who they are now, but also if you'd like to see an artist live, Cara Hunter, who is a best-selling author, will be doing a turn in St Barnabas Church on the 14th of October, talking about the other inspector in Oxford, not Inspector Morse. Please come along to that. You'll find it on Universe. These things all cost a tiny bit of money. So if you'd like to contribute, there is a crowd fund, which I hope the details will come up any moment now. But there we are. If you'd like to contribute, Lloyds Bank, 139626, Jericho Good Works 48518460. All small amounts are welcome. But all I can say, thank you very much, all 4 of you, for a brilliant hour, and enjoy yourselves. Next week, Jericho question time, same place. Cheerio.
Yeah.